The morning of the auction, there were 31 turkeys nobody wanted. They stood crowded together in a back pen behind the Krebs County livestock barn, their feathers dull, their legs uncertain beneath them, their heads tilted at the wrong angles, as if they had given up on the idea of standing straight. One of them had a film over its left eye. Two of them coughed in the way that sick birds cough, dry and small, like something rattling in a paper sack. The rest just stood there in the cold November air, breathing too fast, waiting for whatever came next. What came next was supposed to be the rendering truck. Earl Mecklin, who had brought them down from his place in the hollow, had already shaken hands with the man who hauled the dead and the dying, and the arrangement was understood without paperwork. The birds had come from a flock he had bought cheap from an estate sale and tried to fatten on the wrong feed in the wrong barn, and now, 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, they were not going to make weight, were not going to make color, were not going to make money. Earl had brought them to the barn out of habit more than hope, in case some fool wanted them for stock pots, and when no fool appeared, he had resigned himself to taking what the renderer would give, which was almost nothing, which was the going rate for almost nothing. That was when Hattie Boone walked through the side door of the barn with her hands in the pockets of her grandfather's barn coat and her hair tied back with a piece of baling twine, because she had not thought far enough ahead that morning to find a proper tie. She was 22 years old. She had come back to Krebs County 4 months earlier from a college she had not finished, to a farmhouse she had not asked for, willed to her by a grandfather she had loved more than she had ever told him. She stopped in front of the pen and did not say anything for a long time. She looked at the birds the way her grandfather used to look at a piece of green wood before deciding whether it would split clean. She crouched. She watched the one with the filmed eye blink. She watched the two coffin ones cough. She watched the others breathe. Behind her, in the bleachers that ring the small auction floor, 3 men who had been there since coffee leaned forward on their elbows and grinned at each other in the slow practiced way of men who had been grinning at each other for 40 years. Dewey Halpin, who farmed 800 acres of corn out past the river and who had opinions about everything, was the first to speak. He spoke loud enough to carry. He said, "Well now, the Boone girl's about to make herself a businesswoman." Old Marlin Fry laughed without opening his mouth. The third man, whose name was Carl and who never said much, just shook his head. Hattie stood up. She walked over to Earl Mecklin where he stood by the rendering man, and she asked him, plain as asking the time, what he wanted for the lot. Earl named a number so low it was almost an insult to the act of naming. Hattie nodded once. She said she would take all 31. She counted bills out of a folded envelope she pulled from her coat pocket, the kind of envelope a grandfather keeps in a kitchen drawer for 30 years, and she handed them over without ceremony. Earl looked at the rendering man. The rendering man shrugged and climbed back into his truck and drove off with an empty bed. Dewey Halpin called down from the bleachers, "You planning to nurse those back to health by Thursday, sweetheart? Because Thursday's Thanksgiving and them birds ain't gonna be no Thanksgiving for nobody." He had meant it as a prediction of failure. It had turned out to be a prediction of something else entirely. If you are still with me this far, do me one small favor. Tap that like button, drop a comment telling me what city or town you are watching from, and then settle back in, because what Hattie Boone did with 31 turkeys nobody wanted is the kind of story that does not happen the way you think it is going to happen. Now let's begin. Hattie Boone had not come home to Krebs County with a plan. She had come home because her grandfather had died in March, on a Tuesday morning that smelled like cold mud and wood smoke, and because the lawyer in Beckley had called her at her dormitory and told her that the house and the 73 acres and everything on them were now hers, in their entirety, with no contest from anybody, because there was nobody left to contest. Her mother had been gone 11 years by then. Her father had been gone longer, in the way that fathers sometimes go, which was not dead, but absent enough that it amounted to the same thing in the ledger of who would show up. Her grandfather had raised her from the age of 11 on a piece of land that the people in town called the Boone place, because the Boones had lived on it since before anybody could remember, and now the Boone place belonged to her. And she sat in her dormitory with the phone in her hand and understood that she was not going back to her sophomore year of biology after spring break, because there was no version of her life in which she let the house sit empty. She had finished out the semester because her grandfather would have wanted her to, and then she had packed her car, which was a 1994 Chevrolet pickup that had been his and was now hers, and she had driven the 4 hours back through the mountains with the windows down, even though it was raining, because the truck's heater had given up sometime during the Bush administration, and the cab smelled better with the wet air moving through it. She had pulled into the gravel drive in late May. The house had stood there waiting, its tin roof darkened with rain, its porch sagging gently in the middle, the way porches do when they have held a lot of weight for a lot of years. And she had sat in the truck for a long time before she got out, because getting out meant the next part of her life was beginning, and she was not entirely sure she was ready for it to begin. Her great-aunt Verna lived in the smaller house across the field, the one her grandfather had built in 1962 for his sister when her husband died young, and Verna was 84 years old that spring and still walked the quarter-mile of pasture between the two houses every morning to check on whatever needed checking on. Verna had been at the kitchen table when Hattie walked in. She had not gotten up. She had said, "You took your time." And Hattie had said, "The truck doesn't go fast anymore." And Verna had said, "Neither do I." And that had been the welcome. Verna wore a flannel shirt that had been washed so many times it was the color of dried hay, and a pair of canvas work pants, and a wool vest that her brother had given her in 1978, and she wore all of it without self-consciousness because she had earned the right. She poured Hattie a cup of coffee that had been on the burner since dawn. She slid a paper plate of cornbread across the table. She said, "Your granddaddy left you the place. Now you got to figure out what to do with it." And then she had not spoken again for 40 minutes, while Hattie ate the cornbread and drank the coffee and looked out the window at the pasture sloping down toward the creek. And the silence had not felt empty. It had felt like a room being made for her to think in. The 73 acres were not the kind of acres that impressed anybody. Most of them were too steep for row crops and too wooded for grazing anything bigger than a goat. The bottom along the creek was good ground, maybe 8 acres of it, but it flooded every other spring and you could not count on it. The barn was old, the chicken house was older. There was a smokehouse that had not smoked anything since 1989, and a spring house that still ran cold water in July, and a corn crib that leaned slightly to the east in a way that suggested it had made peace with gravity, and gravity had made peace back. There were no cattle. Her grandfather had sold the last of his small herd 2 years before he died, when his hip stopped letting him chase them. There were 6 laying hens that Verna had been tending in his absence. There was a barn cat named Mose who was older than Hattie. That was the operation she had inherited. She spent June walking the place. She walked it in the morning before the heat came up and again in the evening after it broke, and she carried a small notebook in her back pocket because her grandfather had always carried a small notebook in his back pocket, and she wrote down what she saw. She wrote down where the deer had come through the fence line. She wrote down which apple trees in the old orchard were still bearing and which had given up. She wrote down the names of the plants she did not recognize so she could ask Verna later, and Verna always knew, and Verna would say the name once and not repeat it. So Hattie learned to listen the first time. By the end of June, she had filled half the notebook and she had not made a single decision about what she was going to do. And Verna had not pressed her, because Verna believed that decisions made in a hurry were the kind you spent the rest of your life apologizing to. In July, Verna brought her into the back room of her own house, which Hattie had been inside maybe 4 times in her life, and which was the room where Verna kept the things she did not want anybody touching. There was a roll-top desk in the corner that had belonged to Hattie's great-grandfather. Verna opened the bottom drawer of the desk and pulled out a stack of ledger books bound in black cloth, the kind of books that country merchants used to keep accounts in. And she set them on the kitchen table, and she said, "Your granddaddy wrote in these from the time he was 19 until the year he stopped." She did not say what year he had stopped. She did not need to. She said, "You ought to read them." Then she went out to the garden and left Hattie alone with 31 years of a man's handwriting. Hattie read the ledgers across the rest of July and into August. They were not diaries. Her grandfather had not been the kind of man to write down his feelings, and on the pages where another man might have written about grief or hope, he had written down the price of feed corn and the date of the first frost and the weight of a hog at slaughter. But across the years, a pattern emerged in the margins, a series of notes about birds, specifically about turkeys, and specifically about a strain of turkeys that he and his father before him had kept on the place from before the Second World War. He called them the old birds. He wrote about their slow growth and their dark meat and their habit of foraging the woodlots for acorns and beetles and whatever else a turkey could find that was not feed corn. He wrote about how the hatcheries had stopped carrying them by 1968 and how he had kept a small breeding flock alive on the place for another 20 years out of sheer stubbornness, and how he had finally let the last hen die without replacement in 1991 because nobody wanted what she made anymore. The grocery stores wanted big white birds. The processors wanted big white birds. The old birds took 8 months to finish instead of 4, and they dressed out smaller, and they cost more to raise per pound. And nobody, her grandfather had written in his careful slanted hand, was willing to pay what they were worth because nobody remembered what they tasted like. In the margin of the page dated November 1991, where he had noted the death of the last old hen, he had written 4 words and underlined them once. The words were, somebody ought to remember. Hattie read those words, and she closed the ledger, and she sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Then she walked across the field to Verna's house, and she asked Verna whether anybody in the county still kept the old birds. Verna was at the stove. She did not turn around. She said, "Lemuel Trask out past Beaver Creek had a few, last I knew. He's older than me. He won't have them much longer." Hattie said, "Do you think he'd sell me some?" Verna stirred the pot. She said, "You'd have to ask him." Then she said, after a pause that was not long, but was not short either, "Those are the ones." Hattie drove out to Lemuel Trask's place the next morning. Lemuel was 89 and lived alone in a house that had not seen paint since the Carter administration, and he came out onto the porch with a shotgun in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other, because that was how he answered the door. When Hattie told him whose granddaughter she was, he set the shotgun down. When she told him what she had come for, he laughed for a long time, and the laugh turned into a cough, and the cough turned into him sitting down on the porch step and shaking his head. He said, "Child, those birds ain't worth nothing. I keep them because I'm too old to stop keeping them. You want some, you can have them. I'll throw in the eggs." Hattie said she would pay him. Lemuel said he would not take her money. They argued about it the way country people argue about money, which is gently and without giving ground, and in the end Hattie left with 4 hens and 1 tom in the bed of her truck, and a promise to come back in the spring for whatever eggs the hens laid that he did not want to set himself. Lemuel watched her drive out, and he stood on the porch a long time after she was gone. And what he was thinking he kept to himself, but he went inside afterward and he made a phone call to a cousin he had not spoken to in 6 years, and he said, "The Boone girl come for the old birds today." And the cousin said, "Well, I'll be," and that was the entire phone call, but it traveled. By September, Hattie had built a new pen for the 5 birds on a flat patch of ground behind the barn, fenced on all sides and roofed over against hawks, with a small wooden house in the center that she had built out of lumber pulled off the failing corn crib. She fed them what her grandfather's ledger said to feed them, which was a mix of cracked corn and oats and a little bit of fish meal she had to drive 40 miles to buy. And she let them out into the woodlot every afternoon to forage among the fallen acorns, and she watched them with a patience that surprised even her. She named none of them. She held that line. She almost held that line. The Tom had a particular way of cocking his head when she came near the pen, and she found herself calling him, in her own mind only and never out loud, the General, because he carried himself like one. By October, the hens were laying. By the time of the first hard frost, 3 of the hens had gone broody, and Hattie had set their eggs under them and was waiting to see what would hatch. What hatched in late October and into the first week of November were 19 poults, dark-feathered and quick-eyed and so small they could stand on a silver dollar, and Hattie kept them in a brooder in the back of the barn under a heat lamp her grandfather had bought in 1983, and which still worked because the things her grandfather had bought tended to still work. She wrote down the hatch date of each one in her notebook. She wrote down which hen had set which clutch. She wrote down the weight of each poult on the day she first weighed them, and again a week later, and again a week after that. She was building a record, the way her grandfather had built a record, because the record was the only argument she was ever going to make for what she was doing, and she had already decided that she was not going to argue with anybody about it in the words. That was the same week she walked into the Krebs County livestock barn and bought Earl Mecklen's 31 sick turkeys for almost nothing, while Dewey Halpin laughed from the bleachers. Dewey had thought she was buying them for Thanksgiving. He had thought she was foolish enough to imagine she could turn around 31 ruined birds in 14 days. What Dewey did not understand, and what Hattie did not bother to explain, was that she had not bought them for Thanksgiving at all. She had bought them because 2 of them, the 2 with the filmed eye and the worst cough, were not the same kind of bird as the other 29. She had seen it from across the pen. They were smaller. Their legs were finer. Their tail feathers, even dirty and broken, carried a bronze cast that the big white birds did not have and could not have. They were old birds. Earl Mecklin had bought them in a job lot from an estate sale and had not known what he had, and the estate had not known what it had either, and the chain of not knowing went back probably to whoever had let the original flock die out, and somewhere in that chain of forgetting, 2 birds had survived by accident and ended up in a back pen waiting for a rendering truck. Hattie had bought 31 birds to get the 2. The other 29 she nursed for a week in a separate pen with clean water and good feed, and the ones that lived she gave away to families in the hollow who would put them in a pot, and the ones that did not live she buried at the edge of the wood lot without ceremony, and she did not tell anybody in town about any of it. The 2 old birds she put in with the General and the 4 hens, and the General accepted them after a day of posturing, and by Christmas they were part of the flock, and by spring the hens were laying again, and Hattie had 26 breeding birds, where she had started with 5. She had not made $1 yet. She had spent almost everything in her grandfather's envelope on feed and fencing, and the trip to buy fish meal. Verna had watched all of it without comment, which was Verna's way of approving, and once in February she had walked into Hattie's kitchen and set a jar of apple butter on the counter and said, "Slow is a kind of speed," and walked back out. And Hattie had understood that to be the longest speech Verna had made to her in months. The first sales did not happen until the following October, almost a full year after the auction. Hattie had grown out 12 birds from the spring hatch, 12 toms that she had finished on acorns and oats across the long summer, and she had processed them herself in the old smokehouse with help from a teenage boy named Quill Hagan, who lived down the road and who needed work and who did not ask too many questions. She had no buyers. She had no advertising. She had a hand-lettered sign that she stuck in the ground at the end of her driveway, and the sign said simply, "Heritage Turkeys, by order," and a phone number. And she had not expected the sign to do much, because signs at the end of driveways in Krebs County did not do much as a rule. What she had not counted on was Verna's second cousin once removed, a woman named Pauline who worked as a prep cook at a restaurant 2 counties over, and who had stopped by Verna's house in August for a visit and had eaten a piece of turkey breast that Hattie had cooked from a bird that had died of an accident and could not be sold, and who had gone back to her restaurant and told the chef about it. And the chef, who was from Charleston and had opinions, had driven out to the Boone place himself in September to look at the birds. And he had stood at the fence for a long time and watched the general strut. And he had said to Hattie, "How many can you have for me by the second week of November?" And Hattie had said, "8." And the chef had said, "I will take all 8, and we will talk about next year before you go." He had paid her a deposit in cash, counted out on the hood of her grandfather's truck, and the deposit had been more money than Hattie had seen in one place since she had moved back to the county. She had folded the bills into the same envelope she had carried to the auction the November before. She had not said thank you, because the chef had not said you are welcome, because neither of them had treated the exchange as a favor. It was a transaction between two people who understood what was being transacted, which in Hattie's experience was the rarest kind of transaction there was. The chef came back the second week of November and loaded the 8 dressed birds into coolers in the back of his station wagon, and he ate a piece of cornbread at Verna's kitchen table because Verna had made it clear without saying anything that he was not leaving the property without eating. And then he drove the 4 hours back to Charleston with 8 turkeys that nobody else in the state could have sold him. He served them across Thanksgiving weekend to a dining room of people who had reservations made 6 weeks in advance, and on the menu he listed them by the name of the farm, which was the Boone place, and he listed the breed by its proper name, which Hattie had given him out of her grandfather's ledger, and he listed the price at a number that would have made Dewey Halpin choke on his coffee if Dewey Halpin had ever set foot in a restaurant of that kind, which he had not. The reservations the following week sold out faster. By December, the chef had called Hattie twice more, once to ask whether she could have birds for him by Christmas, which she could not, and once to ask whether she would commit to 40 birds the following Thanksgiving, which she said she would consider. And she meant it when she said it, because 40 was a number she would have to grow into carefully and not all at once. That winter she expanded the pen. She did it herself, with Quill Hagen on the weekends, and she did it with lumber she pulled off the smokehouse roof and replaced with new tin. And she did it without borrowing a dollar from anybody, because borrowing money was the one thing her grandfather had written about in the ledgers with anything resembling heat. He had written, in 1974, that a man who borrows to grow faster than the land will carry him is a man who has decided that the bank knows his place better than he does, and Hattie had underlined that line in pencil and copied it into the front of her own notebook. She built the new pen 40 feet by 60, with the same hawk roof and the same wooden house in the center, only larger, and by the time the spring hens started laying, she had room enough for the flock to triple without crowding. It did not triple that year. It grew the way she let it grow, which was by what the hens produced and what the woodlot could feed, and by the following autumn she had 38 grown birds, where she had had 12 the year before, and she had 3 new customers besides the chef in Charleston, 2 of them restaurants in Lewisburg and one of them a small market in Beckley that catered to people who cared about where their food came from and were willing to pay for the caring. The talk in town shifted in the way talk in small town shifts, which is not all at once and not with any single conversation, but in increments small enough that nobody had to admit they had ever thought differently. By the second spring after the auction, the men at the feed store had stopped grinning when Hattie came in to order, and had started nodding at her the way they nodded at each other, which was the highest form of acknowledgement available in the county. Earl Mecklin himself had stopped her in the parking lot of the IGA in March and had cleared his throat in the way a man clears his throat when he is about to say something he has been working up to for a while, and he had said, "Them 2 birds you got off me at the sale." Hattie had said, "Yes, sir." Earl had said, "I didn't know what I had." Hattie had said, "No, sir, you didn't." Earl had nodded and had looked at his boots for a moment and had said, "Well?" And then he had walked into the store without saying anything else, and Hattie had understood that to be an apology, and she had accepted it as one. And the next time Earl came across a bird he thought she might want, he called her before he took it to the barn. Dewey Halpin took longer. Dewey was the kind of man who had built his identity over 40 years on being right about things, and being right about things meant never having to revisit the things he had been right about. And the idea that the Boone girl had made him wrong in front of Marlin Fry and Carl, whoever sat on him through that whole second year like a stone in his boot. He did not come around. He did not stop her in any parking lot. What he did, in the third autumn after the auction, when the chef in Charleston had committed to 60 birds and the markets in Lewisburg and Beckley had committed to 40 between them, and Hattie had grown her flock to 112 and had hired Quill Hagan on as steady help and had brought in Quill's younger sister Maren. Besides, he drove out to the Boone place on a Saturday morning in October without calling first. He came up the gravel drive in his big crew cab pickup, and he parked beside the barn, and he got out, and he stood for a minute looking at the new pen, which had been expanded again that summer, and now ran a full acre with rotating sections so the birds could move through fresh forage every week. Hattie came out of the barn with a 5-gallon bucket of oats in her hand, and she saw him standing there, and she set the bucket down, and she walked over to him. Dewey said, "That's a lot of birds." Hattie said, "It is." Dewey said, "I owe you something." Hattie said, "You don't owe me anything." Dewey said, "I do, and I'm not going to make a large production out of it. But I was wrong about what you bought that day, and I have thought about it more than I care to admit. And I came out here to say so, and to ask whether there is any work you need a hand with that I might do this fall to make myself useful." Hattie looked at him for a long time. She looked at him the way she had looked at the 31 sick turkeys, which was without hurry and without judgment, and then she said, "The back fence along the wood lot needs replaced before winter, and I have not had time." Dewey said, "I'll be back Monday with my post driver." And he was. And he replaced 240 feet of fence over 3 days, and he would not take payment for it, and when he was done he shook Hattie's hand the way he shook the hand of a man whose word was good, and he got in his truck and he drove home. And from that week forward, Dewey Halpin spoke of Hattie Boone in the feed store and at the diner, and at the volunteer fire department meetings in a tone that other men learned to match, because Dewey had been the loudest doubter and was now the loudest convert. And conversion travels in small towns the same way mockery does, which is fast, and without anybody having to be told. The word kept moving. By the 4th autumn after the auction, Hattie had a waiting list. She had not advertised once. She had not made a website because she did not particularly want one, and she had not printed a card because the people who needed to find her found her. The chef in Charleston had told a chef in Lexington, and the chef in Lexington had told a writer for a magazine that wrote about food in the southern states, and the writer had driven out to the Boone place in August of that 4th year and had spent 2 days walking the woodlot with Hattie and sitting at Verna's kitchen table eating whatever Verna put in front of her. And the article that came out in October ran with a photograph of Hattie standing at the new pen with the general, who was by then 6 years old and grizzled around the beak, but still carrying himself like the general. And the article called the birds by their proper name, and called the farm by its proper name, and called Hattie by her proper name. And the phone at the Boone place rang for 3 weeks afterward until Hattie unplugged it and put a note on the door for new customers that said, "Taking orders for next year only? Leave your number with Verna across the field." Verna took the numbers. Verna was 88 by then, and she had slowed in the way that very old people slow, which is not in any one motion but in the willingness to make motions at all. And she sat at her kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a pen, and she wrote down every name and every number and every order. And when people came to the door of the small house, she made them sit and eat a piece of whatever she had baked that morning before she would write their name down. And nobody objected, because by then it had become understood that the way you got a Boone turkey was that you sat down in Verna Boone's kitchen and you ate her cornbread, and you waited until she decided you were the kind of person who deserved a place on the list. The list was not first come, first served. Verna ran it her own way, and her own way involved a series of small considerations that she never explained to anybody, and Hattie never questioned them, because Hattie had learned by then that Verna's judgment about people was the most reliable instrument on the property. Verna died on a Wednesday morning in February of the 5th year, in her own bed, in the small house her brother had built her in 1962, with the wool vest from 1978 folded on the chair beside the bed, and the yellow legal pad with that year's orders on the kitchen table where she had left it the night before. Hattie found her at 7 in the morning when she walked over with coffee, the way she had walked over with coffee every morning for 4.5 years, and she stood in the doorway of the bedroom for a long time before she did anything else, because there was nothing that needed doing in a hurry, and Verna would not have wanted anything done in a hurry, and the quiet of the house was the quiet Verna had spent her whole life making, and Hattie did not want to be the one to break it. She sat down in the chair beside the bed. She picked up the wool vest. She held it in her lap. She cried without sound, the way her grandfather had cried at her mother's funeral 11 years before, which was the only time she had ever seen him cry. And she understood for the first time that she had learned how to cry from him without him ever having tried to teach her. The funeral was small. Verna had outlived almost everybody she had grown up with, and the people who came to the church on the hill above the creek were mostly people who had known her only as an old woman, which Verna would have considered the correct order of things. Lemuel Trask came, 93 years old by then and walking with 2 canes, and he sat in the back pew and he did not speak to anybody. But after the service he walked up to Hattie at the graveside and he put a hand on her shoulder and he said, "Your aunt knew what was what." And Hattie said, "Yes, sir, she did." And Lemuel said, "You keep them birds going." And Hattie said, "I will." And Lemuel nodded once and walked back to his nephew's car and was driven home. And he died himself the following August, and Hattie drove out to his place for that funeral too. And she stood at his graveside, and she thought about the 4 hens and the 1 tom he had loaded into her truck 5 summers before. And she thought about how everything she had built had come out of those 5 birds and out of her grandfather's ledgers and out of Verna's silence. And she understood that she was now the only person left who remembered any of it from the beginning, and that the remembering was now her job, and that the job did not end. She kept Verna's small house exactly as it was for a long time. She did not move into it, because she did not need to, and she did not rent it out, because she could not imagine anybody else's furniture in those rooms. She used the kitchen for sorting orders. She used the back room with the roll-top desk for the ledgers, which she kept now in the same hand her grandfather had used, with the same careful slant, in books she had bought from a stationer in Beckley that still carried the old kind. She wrote down the hatch date of every poult. She wrote down the weight of every bird at slaughter. She wrote down the price of every sale and the name of every customer, and the day the first frost came, and the day the last frost went, and the ledgers thickened year over year, and the handwriting in them settled into something that was hers, but that anybody who had known her grandfather would have recognized as a continuation. The 6th year, she finally agreed to take on the 40 birds for the chef in Charleston, and the 60 for the new customers, and the 30 for the markets, and she did it by adding a 3rd pen and by clearing another 2 acres of the wood lot for rotational forage, and she did it without borrowing, because she had saved across the lean years the way her grandfather had saved across his, and because she had refused every offer of investment that had come her way after the magazine article ran, of which there had been more than she had expected, and all of which she had turned down with the same flat line, which was, "I appreciate the offer, but I am going to grow this the same way as everything else." The men who made the offers, most of them from cities, most of them in suits they had bought for the visit, had not understood the line, but they had understood that she meant it, and they had gone away, and most of them had not come back, and the ones who had come back as customers and not as investors, which was the only way back she had left open to them. By the 7th autumn after the auction, the Boone place ran 180 birds through the season, and Hattie employed Quill Hagan full-time and Marin Hagan part-time and 2 other young people from the Hollow besides, and she paid them better than the feed mill did, and she gave them the day after Thanksgiving off, which the feed mill did not, and she had a small line of preserved goods that Verna's old recipes had become the spine of, apple butter and pepper jelly, and a smoked turkey stock that the chef in Charleston bought by the case. And she had restored the smokehouse to working order, and she had rebuilt the corn crib so it no longer leaned, and the house itself she had painted in the summer of the 6th year, the same white it had been when she was a child, with the same dark green trim, and the porch she had jacked up and reset on new piers so that it no longer sagged in the middle. And standing at the end of the driveway in October light, the place looked the way her grandfather had always seen it, which was not the way it had ever quite looked in his lifetime, but the way he had carried it in his head. And Hattie understood, without anybody telling her, that the place looking that way was a kind of conversation she was having with him across the years, and that the conversation would continue as long as she kept the place standing. The general died in the 8th year, in March, of nothing in particular except age, which in a turkey of his line was a respectable thing to die of. Hattie found him in the morning in the wooden house at the center of the original pen, lying on his side in the straw with his eyes closed and his great bronze tail folded behind him, and she carried him out herself in both arms because he was too big for one, and she buried him at the edge of the wood lot near where she had buried the birds from Earl Mecklen's lot 7 Novembers before, and she marked the spot with a flat stone from the creek, and she did not tell anybody for a week that he was gone, because she wanted the week to feel like his week and not like a week of condolences. When she finally told Quill, Quill said, "He was a good bird," and Hattie said, "He was the bird," and Quill nodded and did not say anything else, because Quill had learned from Hattie the way Hattie had learned from Verna, which was that the right number of words for most occasions was fewer than you thought. She kept 3 of the general's direct descendants as breeding toms after that, and she watched them across the next spring to see which of them carried himself the way the general had carried himself, and one of them did, a young tom she had hatched out the previous April, and she did not name him either, but in her notebook she wrote beside his hatch number the words, "This one." And the line continued, and the ledgers thickened, and the years kept turning the way years turn on a place that is being kept properly, which is slowly on the surface and deeply underneath. In the 10th November after the auction, on a cold morning that smelled the way that first morning had smelled, Hattie drove the old Chevrolet down to the Krebs County Livestock Barn for the first time in a decade. She had not been back since the day she bought the 31 birds. She had no reason to go back except that the county had put on a small fall market in the parking lot that year, a thing somebody had organized to bring people in from the surrounding hollows. And the organizers had asked Hattie whether she would set up a table, and she had said she would, because she had decided that the time had come to be visible in the place where she had once been laughed at, not to prove anything to anybody, but because the proving was finished, and the being visible was a different thing now, a thing she owed to whoever was watching, who might be the next girl in a barn coat with an envelope of cash and an idea nobody else could see. She set up her table along the side of the barn, on the gravel, with a folding chair and a cooler of smoke-stock jars and a small hand-lettered sign that said, "The Boone Place, Heritage Turkeys and Preserves." And she sat down and she waited, and the people came, and she sold what she had brought before noon, and she signed up 41 new names for the next year's waiting list on a yellow legal pad that had been Verna's, and she shook a lot of hands, and she did not say much because she had never said much, and what she did say, she meant. Around 11 in the morning, Dewey Halpin walked up to her table with a paper cup of coffee in one hand and a folded bill in the other, and he bought 2 jars of pepper jelly that he did not particularly need, and he said, "Your aunt would have liked this," and Hattie said she would have run it better. And Dewey laughed, and it was a real laugh, the kind he had laughed across his whole life at things that genuinely pleased him, and he walked away into the crowd, and Hattie watched him go, and she thought, briefly and without bitterness, of the morning he had called down from the bleachers, and she understood that the distance between that morning and this one was the distance she had walked, and that the walk had been worth every step of it, and that there was no part of it she would have hurried even if she could have. Late in the afternoon, as the market was closing down and the light was going long and gold across the gravel, a young woman walked up to Hattie's table. She was maybe 19. She wore a barn coat that was too big for her, and that had been somebody else's, and her hair was tied back with a piece of twine, and she stood in front of the table without speaking for a long moment, the way a person stands in front of a thing she does not yet know how to ask about. And Hattie recognized the standing because she had done the standing herself once in front of a pen of sick birds on a morning that had decided the rest of her life. Hattie waited. She did not rush the girl. The girl finally said, "My granddaddy left me his place out by Sinking Creek, and there is an old orchard on it that nobody has touched in 30 years, and everybody tells me it ain't worth nothing." And Hattie,